Wait a minute, are you changing the murder weapon? I thought this was a true story.
There's a lot of blood, a lot of carnage. Who's to say how it was done?
Okay, so who did it?
So, the woman, she's still hysterical, says her husband did it. And he's still here. In the closet.
Huh, the husband, eh? So is this a warning to all future brides?
Hey, no backseats. You're locked in.
So the lighthouse keeper creeps over to the closet, opens the door, and, sure enough, there's a man inside. But he's sliced out his own insides with a meat hook. Horrified, he looks closer to see the dead man's face in the dark. Closer. Closer. And he sees it's his own face. And then its eyes bulge out and screams.
So gross.
horrible.
Hey-oh, super twist.
Nice.
Nice one, Squire.
You have me going. Pretty cool.
Heavy on the cheese there, corn dog.
Okay, you've all had your fun. We should all turn in. There's some weather hitting our way.
No, because according to standard vessel regulation, we're all required one more beer before hitting the hay.
What regulations are these?
It's standard issue regulatory institutional protocol subdivision 1099.
Hello everybody and welcome to this video looking at Man of Medan. I hope I've said that correctly. I think that's how it's pronounced. This is the latest horror game from the developers of Until Dawn, and it comes to us in a week that's been pretty heavy on for the narrative-based games. On digitallydownloaded.net we've got Reviews of Control, the latest edition of Life is Strange, and we've got this one. So yeah, it's been a very big week for narrative stuff, which is great because this is a narrative-driven horror game as well, and it's pretty good. If you played Until Dawn, you'll know what to expect from it. But I thought I'd do a video looking at it because it is also an interesting concept that the developers have got going on, and I think it's worth talking about as a fan of horror. So the developers have been out there talking about how this anthology will be a series of games, each one looking at a particular sub-genre or trope of horror. And Until Dawn actually kind of belongs to the series as well, even though it's not an official title in it, because Until Dawn was a teen slasher horror styled game, and it was quite effective at sticking to genre conventions and working within them. This one is a very different type of horror. This is a ghost ship story. We don't know what's coming for the rest of the anthology, but we know they're meant to be about 6 months apart each one, and if they do work in the way that this one does, and that is to keep quite traditional while being interesting to fans of the genre, then I think the developers are onto something pretty good. Now, with the ghost ship story, I mean, it's a classic of horror. It's been around for a very long time. Everybody knows about the Flying Dutchman and those kinds of stories, and it makes sense as a setting for horror for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the ocean itself is quite inhospitable in itself. It's not a good place to be stuck on, so if you ever find yourself on a ship that breaks down in the middle of the ocean, you will feel quite a lot of terror. So the environment itself that these stories take place in makes sense for horror. And on top of that, the actual ships themselves are a good location for horror for a couple of reasons. They tend to be quite claustrophobic with the thin corridors and small rooms, and there is obviously no escape because you are again on this inhospitable environment. Otherwise you can't just jump in the water and escape. You're stuck there with whatever terrors are on the boat with you. So small space, enclosed space, and no escape all combines to make the perfect breeding ground for some terror and spooks. This game captures all of that absolutely brilliantly, it must be said. The game does a really good job of creating the claustrophobia. Firstly, it has very cinematic angles, and a lot of the time it relies on techniques similar to what we saw in the earlier Resident Evil games way back on the PlayStation 1, with the pre-rendered backgrounds and the sharp angles being used to hide things behind, and you're never quite sure what's around the corner because you can't just tilt your camera around and stuff. The developers have kind of gone old school with this. It's a much more advanced version than obviously what Resident Evil did, and the camera will scroll and move around and stuff rather than being static, but it is used cinematic effect, and it's very stilt and it's very sharp, and the developers really do hide things behind scenery quite effectively. So on that basis, the game does a great job of building tension as a technical work. It's very effective. The team is obviously very familiar with how horror works, and while this game doesn't have too many outright jump scares, when it does them very effectively. While the game doesn't have too much by way of really kind of ugly monsters, there's a lot of kind of tension building in this one, and there's a lot, I mean, for a very long time you don't really see monsters. You know they're there somewhere, and you know that at some point your characters are going to run into them, but for the longest time the real threat is more the human side of things, because you're actually stuck on the boat with a bunch of rather nasty people as well who are trying to hunt you down. So the game does a great job of building tension. It does a great job of being that kind of cinematic horror. It's not too heavily reliant on the grotesque and the jump scares. It tries to be a little bit more psychological. That's not to say it's necessarily smart. It's still that kind of B-grade horror tradition, as most ghost ship stories are, but it does try to be something a little bit more cerebral and something a little bit more intelligent than just a standard kind of monster, ghost, haunted house kind of experience. So if you've played Until Dawn, you'll know basically how this game plays. It's pretty much the same thing. Your control over your characters is fairly limited, and you can't really do much more than move them from point A to point B, where the next cutscene will drop in. It's almost like an FMV game in that way. Most of the interaction comes from QuickTime events that pop up during any action moment, and they work well enough. I know QTEs can be a little bit frustrating for some people, but I think they are not too invasive this time around. It's not a David Cage game, that's for sure. And other than that, the only other real interaction you have is the decisions you need to make, which really determine who is going to live and who is going to die in this game. So every so often you'll have a choice between a couple of different actions or a couple of different voice responses to things, and depending on those choices that you make, it will affect how the narrative plays out. There are 5 main characters, and in the game every single one of them can survive the experience, and every single one of them can die. It's actually possible to lose every single character in this if you play particularly badly or make the wrong decisions. And what I really liked about this game was those decisions aren't particularly projected. The game follows a very organic path with its narrative and its storytelling, and a lot of the time you'll feel like each option that you've got is a fairly valid one, and you'll have to make the decision quickly because they're on timers, but you won't make the decision because you know that an outcome will come as a result of it. You'll make a decision based on how you feel like the character should respond, and then you'll see the consequences of that. As a result, there's also quite a lot of replay value in the game, which is good because the game itself is quite short. I play my horror games in short bursts, and I was still able to finish this one in a couple of days, partly because I did keep coming back to it, but partly because it is a short story. The developer is pitching these as kind of anthology, and as an anthology, that is a series of shorter games rather than one extended long game. So that's a literary technique that was used in poetry and a lot of books, where it's a collection of short stories rather than one kind of lengthy piece. So now that the developers have kind of checked off teen horror and ghost stories, it'll be interesting to see what comes next in this anthology. Like I said, they're coming every 6 months apart or thereabouts, and I'm sure there'll be a Lovecraftian one at some point, because every game developer likes to play around with Lovecraft. But it'll be good to see if they can expand into some genres of horror where there's perhaps not so many video games that test it. So something like the more psychological horrors, something like Black Swan, you know, that kind of story could make for a really effective horror game using this particular approach to game development. But most horror games are more action-based and therefore can't really make the Black Swan psychological narrative work. So I'm quite keen to see how the developer goes with this series going forwards. I think they're going to be quite successful because this one does tick all the boxes, and it seems like they've got a very strong sense about what they want to do with this series. So yeah, I'm very impressed. That's my coverage for this game. I don't want to give away too much in the video clips because, as with all horrors, the surprises are part of the fun. I hope you enjoyed the video though. I hope it's interesting. Do check out my review on digitallydownloaded.net once that goes up, because, you know, it'll put more words to my thoughts. And other than that, please do back me on Patreon. I got my begging. I always beg. Please do back me. Those backers really help me continue to do more of these, and I look forward to seeing you at the next video. Thank you very much for your time, And do let me know what you think of Man of Medan once you get a chance to play it in the comments. Have a good day.